ဒီနေ့မနေ့ကဝန်ခံသွားတဲ့အတိုင်းဓမ္မစကပောဒနာသုတ်တံရှေ့ပိုင်းအစွန်းနှစ်သွယ်တယုတ်ဖော်ပြပြီးတော့အဲဒီအစွန်းနှစ်သွယ်ကစွန်းနှစ်သွယ်ကိုရှောင်တိန်တဲ့နီးပေါ့လေအဲ့ဒါလေးတွေပြောပါမယ်တသုတ်လုံးပြည့်စုံတော့ဘုန်းကြီးမဟောနိုင်ပါဘူးဒီရရမြ
As Sayadaw promised yesterday, he will continue to talk on the subject of the first discourse that the Buddha gave. As you know, the sutta is called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the sutra that sets into motion the wheel of the law, the wheel of the Dhamma. Sayadaw will not be able to give a thorough discourse on this sutta, but will deal only with that aspect of avoiding the two extremes of practice so that one can walk on the middle path.
Buddha မပွင့်ခင်ကကဘာသူကဘာသားတွေအခြေအနေနည်းနည်းလေးပြောပြရစီကဘာသူကဘာသားတွေအခြေအနေဟာလမ်းနှစ်သွယ်သူတို့လိုက်နေကြတယ်တစ်သွယ်ကစိတ်အလိုကြလွတ်ထားတဲ့တစ်သွယ်စိတ်အလိုကြလွတ်ထားတယ်ဆိုတာကကာမဂုဏ်အာယုန်တွေပေါ်မှာထင်တယ်လို့ပေါ့လေလွတ်လွတ်လပ်လပ်ကြည်ချထားတာလွတ်လပ်ခွင့်ပေးထားတာလူဘဝဖြစ်ရတာဟာကာမဂုဏ်အာယုန်တွေနဲ့နေရတာဒါနိဗ္ဗာန်ပဲလောကနိဗ္ဗာန်ပဲလို့ဒီလိုအထင်ရောက်ပြီးတော့စိတ်ရှိတိုင်းသူတို့ထင်တဲ့အတိုင်းပေါ့ဒီမှာခံစားပြီးတော့နေတာအဲ့ဒီတလားအဲ့ဒီလမ်းစဉ်ဟာအပျော်စားလမ်းစဉ်ပဲဒီဟာဒီလိုက်စားနေလို့ရှိရင်ဒါသူတို့သူမြတ်တွေအလုံးမဟုတ်ဘူးတာမန်ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေအလုံးပဲဆိုပြီးတော့အထင်ရောက်ပြီးအဲ့ဒီဟာဒီတာယာမိမှဆိုလို့ခန္ဓာကိုယ်ကိုပင်မရောက်နီးမျိုးမျိုးတွေကျင့်ပြီးတော့ကျင့်သုံးတဲ့အတ္တကိလေသာနိယောဂလမ်းစဉ်အဲ့ဒီလမ်းနဲ့တွေ့သူတို့လိုက်နေကြတယ်
It might be appropriate to first of all deal with the situation of the world, the spiritual scene, before the Buddha arose. During that time, it seems that there were two groups of practitioners, two main lines of practice that most people followed, one or the other. The first is the practice of giving total freedom to the whims and fancies of one's mind. This is based on the belief that Nibbana in this world consists in the happiness of enjoying sensual pleasures. So the proponents of this belief behave in such a way as to achieve their goal of total happiness, of Nibbana, their concept of Nibbana on this world, without exercising control over desires, but giving in to the likes and dislikes, the desires and craving of the mind, indulging in sensual pleasures. The other extreme looks upon this sort of practice as very ignoble and base. And the followers of the second path of practice maintain that to deny the mind and body of its needs, of their needs and desires, to be able to do that is a very noble endeavor. So the aim of the second sort of practice is to torture one's own body. It is actually self-mortification, starving the body and mind of gratification and satisfaction, starving the body and mind of pleasure in enjoying sensual objects.
ဘုဒ္ဓကိုယ်တိုင်ပဲတက်တော်29နှစ်ထိကာမဂုဏ်မျိုးစုံလိုက်စားတဲ့အနေပေါ့လေကာမတုခလိကနိယောကလမ်းစဉ်မလွတ်ခဲ့ပါဘူးဒါမှမဟုတ်ဘုရားလောင်းကတော့စိတ်လိုကြလွတ်ထားတဲ့အနေမျိုးတော့လည်းမဟုတ်ပါဘူးပြီးတော့တောထွက်လာပြီးတော့ဒုက္ခရစရိယာကို6နှစ်လုံးလုံးပေါ့လေကျင့်သုံးတာခန္ဓာကိုယ်ပင်မဆင်းရဲရုံပါပဲအတ္တကိလမတနိယောကလမ်းစဉ်အဲ့ဒီလမ်းစဉ်တစ်ခုနဲ့မကင်းခဲ့ပါဘူးဟုတ်လားပဲ
Even the Bodhisattva was not completely freed from these two extremes during his last birth as a human being, prior to his supreme enlightenment. In fact, for the first 29 years of his life, he wallowed and indulged in sensual pleasures. Of course, his indulgence in sensual pleasures is not one of total unrestrained behavior. He was a bodhisattva. He had his paramis and he was able to exercise some sort of restraint. But still, one cannot say that he was freed from the extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasure during that first part of his life. When he left his palace as a renunciate, seeking in search of the truth, he practiced for the first 6 years of his renunciation very torturous practices, these various forms of self-mortification in order to punish the body, to deny it of gratification of the sensual pleasures. He went through this for 6 years, at the end of which he found that it was all in vain. He had not found the truth, but had certainly discovered how painful and torturous it was.
ခန္ဓာကိုယ်ပင်မဆင်းရဲအောင်ကျင့်သုံးတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေထဲမှာဆိုရင်ဘုရားအလောင်းလောက်ကျင့်သုံးတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်မရှိခဲ့ပါဘူးဘုရားအလောင်းကျင့်သုံးမှုကိုဘယ်ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်မှမမီခဲ့ပါဘူးပြင်းထန်ကိုကျင့်သုံးခဲ့ပါတယ်ဓမ္မပြင်းထန်ကျင့်သုံးမှုတွေတော့ဓမ္မဖြည့်ရှင်းပြဖို့အချိန်မရပါဘူး
It is said that there is no one who can surpass the Bodhisattva in the practice of self-mortification prior to his enlightenment. He was a very persistent and committed searcher, seeker of truth. And he summoned up every ounce, every micro ounce of energy that he had available to him in order to try to gain an understanding of the truth, even though the first part of his practice was not the correct way. The Sayadaw is unable, however, to describe at length his various heroic efforts in this practice of self-mortification.
ဒီလိုပင်မစွာကျင့်တဲ့အတွက်အကျိုးကတော့ပင်မကျိုးတက်တက်ပါပဲတပြင်းအကျိုးပါမှမရှိပါဘူး
The only benefit that one can derive out of the practice of self-mortification is none other than self-mortification.
အဲ့ဒီအစွန်းနှစ်တွေဟာမမှန်ဘူးဆိုတာဘုရားလောင်းကသိမြင်တော့ငယ်စဉ်ကာလကတစ်ပင်အောင်မှာကျင့်သုံးခဲ့တဲ့ဟာပြန်လီတရိယာပြီးတော့ဒီလမ်းကတော့မှန်မှာပဲဆိုပြီးတော့အဲ့ဒီလမ်းလေးပြန်ပြီးတော့ကျင့်လန်းစဉ်လေးပြန်ကောက်ဖို့စဉ်းစားတဲ့အခါမှာခန္ဓာကိုယ်ကအားကနည်းနေတော့အစာပြန်ပြီးတော့သုံးဆောင်ရပါတယ်ဒီအစာသုံးဆောင်ပြီးအားထုတ်မှမဂ္ဂင်၈ပါးကျင့်တရားအလယ်လလမ်းစဉ်တွေပေါ့လေဒါတွေရရှိလာပါတယ်
Finally, at the end of his period of self-mortification practice, it dawned upon the Bodhisattva that these two paths of self-indulgence, of indulgence in sensual pleasure, as well as that of self-mortification, do not lead to the realization of truth. They are not the correct path. He certainly recalled an incident when he was a small boy, and he was sitting under a tree meditating. He remembered that that seemed to be a more appropriate way, and he felt very strongly that if he could continue the practice in that way, he would strike on the right path. At that time, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, was very emaciated, for he had been starving himself of food and wanting to continue the practice which he discovered when he was a little boy. He began to take food in suitable amounts, so that he could gain strength physically and thus mentally to continue his practice.
Yuna ngā khana ngā ba yunaတရားတွေသူတို့ဖြစ်ဆဲမှာလိုက်ပြီးတော့ရှုလို့မြဲပုံဆင်းရဲပုံသူသဘောတိုင်းသူဖြစ်ပုံဆိုတာပေါ့ဥပဒနာဉာဏ်นี่အစဉ်တိုင်းတက်ပြီးတော့မဲ့ခင်ရှင်းပါအကျင့်တရားပေါ့ဒီပထမဆုံးပုဗ္ဗဘာကမဲ့နောက်အရိယာမဲ့ပြီးတော့မဲ့၄ပါးဖို့၄ပါးနဲ့နိဗ္ဗာန်မျက်မှောက်ပြုတည်သွားတာပဲအဲ့ဒါမှသဗ္ဗညိတဉာဏ်တော်ကြီးလည်းပဲတပါးတဲ့ခါရရသွားတာဘုရားဖြစ်သွားတာပါ
Having regained his strength, he started to re-walk on that path which he had stumbled upon when he was a little boy. And eventually, he found himself watching the 5 aggregates arising and passing away from moment to moment. He had struck on the right path. He continued watching, and soon, going through the various levels and stages of Vipassana insight, he attained the first pair of path and fruition consciousness, and immediately following that, the second and third and the fourth pair of arahata, of path and fruition of an arahant. At that point, he realized nibbana, and simultaneously gained the omniscient knowledge that he had worked for so many aeons.
Yes, Baba Yagurai Amandiyari, Siye Amandiyari, Dari Kaundila, Siye Pichi Amandiyari, Siye Amandiyana, Siye Yadu Yaucham Ajimandiyari body. This are liver. I left by my name.
In fact, he was developing the Eightfold Path factors, and he was watching the 5 aggregates arise and pass away from moment to moment. This is the first preliminary part of the Noble Path, which brought him to realize successively the various levels of insight. And finally, when he realized Nibbana, the Noble Path was fully developed. And in fact, while he was developing the Eightfold Noble Path factors, he was also looking into the Four Noble Truths. He was actually watching suffering things in being mindful of the 5 aggregates as they arise and pass away. He also came to know of the second noble truth, that of abandoning, or rather, that the cause of suffering was craving, and that the third noble truth, that there is an end to suffering, and that the path to this end is the very one that he is walking on.
Mizima Patipata Kore Jin Laman Dayago Tira Mudwaro O Jungere Lamha Lani Ha Mari Be Sura Yasavia Kurai Yindi Tabare.
Having discovered this middle path, the Buddha knew for sure that the other two extremes of self-mortification and indulgence in sensual pleasure are incorrect paths.
Adi Laman Natwega Kamatukaliga Niyoga Lamhago Myaswafyaga Diluzagaloni Neshum Chagabare. Say Luja, Kamago Ayuni Boma, say Luja, Lutara ha, he no Yunyamare, Pugong Mogong Lidiga, Asawali Daddy, Jaja, come more. You are the Yadari, a late Halep Shibare. Bodozanigo Kilita, two pure Pokuri, a lobe, Usabe. Nari yo, few Simia de Pokuri, Kisama hold. Pero Anata Sayadaw Mimi Josie was a same shade, the Ladamari, Pina, Diluji, the Adin, and Bama Mapate Pahu, Elusic alone in a show chagabara.
In the sutta, the Buddha described this first path, this first extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasure in rather expletive adjectives. He said that indulgence in sensual pleasure is inferior. It was also the way and behavior of village people. Thirdly, it is the work or practice of those who are shrouded thickly by kilesas. It is not the practice of noble ones who cherish purity of mind. And finally, that it will not conduce to any benefit and to the true benefits of sila, samadhi, and panya.
Ataklimatani yoga kore Kophimasiyam Yumya Chia de Jinguro Dukho Kusia Sixia Pisi Namare. Ole Huderi, Subo Achin, Kudolo Jinia, Sashi de Genia Pamazo Savio, Kusiavi, Kusiama, Sixia Vivo Dukho Anario ဖြူစင်မြင့်မြတ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေရဲ့အလုပ်လည်းမဟုတ်ဘူးတဲ့တကယ်သီလသမာဓိပညာအစစ်မှန်တယ်လည်းပဲမပတ်တဲ့တော့အနတ္တတာဟိတောလို့ဒီလိုရှုံချခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒီမှာထူးခြားတာကတော့ကာမောပောထုဇဏီကောဆိုတဲ့ဒီလိုစကားတွေတော့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကသုံးပြီးတော့မရှုံချခဲ့ပါဘူးဒါအကြောင်းရှိပါတယ်ဒုက္ခအနတ္တိအနတ္တဆိုင်
The Buddha then referred to the second extreme of self-mortification as a practice that will conduce only to suffering. This is true. For the ascetics those days who practiced self-mortification had to undergo very austere and painful training. They sat and slept on a bed of nails. They went about naked. And as a result, they had to undergo a lot of bodily suffering, which will eventually result in also mental suffering. Self-mortification is also a practice that does not belong to the Noble One. To those who really cherish morality, sila, concentration, and wisdom. Neither does such a practice of self-mortification conduce to true benefits of sila, concentration, and wisdom. It is perhaps notable to observe that the Buddha did not use two expletives that were used in describing the first extreme. He did not say that self-mortification was the practice of village people, nor did he say that self-mortification is a practice of beings who are engulfed in a thick murk of kilesas.
ဟိနောလို့မချုံရှာတာတော့ဟိုစဉ်ကတပတ်စီခေါ်တဲ့တရားလိုက်စားတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်များဟာဒီအကျင့်ဟာမြင့်မြတ်တဲ့အကျင့်ပဲလို့သူတို့ကဆွဲဆွဲမြဲမြဲယူထားတော့သူတို့ရဲ့စိတ်ဓာတ်ကိုထိမ့်သိမ့်တဲ့အနေနဲ့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကဟိနောယုံညံ့တဲ့အကျင့်ပဲလို့ဒီလိုမရှုံချခဲ့ပါဘူး
He also did not use the word hina or inferior when he referred to the second extreme. There are reasons behind this deliberate extension. The first is that the word hina or inferior was deliberately avoided because of the hermits during that time who had a high respect for that sort of practice.
Kama လို့မရှုံချတာတော့အဲ့ဒီစဉ်ကပပ္ပစိတအမိခံတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်များရဲ့အကျင့်တရားမဟုတ်လို့ဒီရွာသူရွာသားတွေရဲ့တရားမဟုတ်ဘူးဒါမလို့ကာမဆိုတဲ့စကားနဲ့မရှုံချခဲ့ပါဘူး
During those times, self-mortification was also a very popular practice of people who call themselves renunciates. Therefore, according to conventional standards of those times, such a practice of self-mortification was not considered a practice of the village people. It was considered as a practice of renunciates.
Vì đó ấy chuyện này là về lúa trồng thì mấy chuyện này bảo lúa trồng thì nên là mà bắt được bảo là do bắt đầu chuyện này có rồi thì lúa cái là mà sống chả cái bảo.
Self-mortification is also a practice that is beyond the reach of ordinary worldlings or lay people. Therefore, the third adjective was not used. The third adjective, that it is a practice of mere worldlings who are engulfed in this thick cloud of kilesas.
India Vipassana TV ro ho dale lo so India Paṇḍitā Sayadaw khore niya thana ma Visavaki 5 ဦးကိုစတင်ပြီးတော့ဟောပါတယ်
This discourse was given in India, in Benares, at a place called Sarnath, for a group of 5 renunciates.
ဘိက္ခုတို့ကာမစုခလိကနိယောဂလမ်းစဉ်နဲ့အတ္တကိလမတာနိယောဂလမ်းစဉ်ဒီလမ်းစဉ်ဒီအစွန်းနှစ်သွယ်ကိုပယ်ကြအလေလမ်းစဉ်လိုက်ကြဆိုတာပေါ့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကမဂ္ဂင်၈ပါးကျင့်တရားတွေစပြပါတယ်
The Buddha began to talk of the Eightfold Noble Path by referring firstly to these 2 extremes. Because, he said, these 2 extremes of indulgence in self, indulgence in sense pleasures, and self-mortification should not be followed.
Adi Mīcima Paṭipādā ခေါ်တဲ့မဂ္ဂင်၈ပါးအကျင့်တရားဟာတနည်းအားခွဲပြသွားတဲ့အတိုင်းကမ္မတက္ကတာတမာဒိဋ္ဌိအစရှိတဲ့တမာဒိဋ္ဌိပါဝင်ပေါ့လေဒါမျိုးတွေပါပဲအဲ့ဒီတည်းကလုပ်ငန်းနဲ့ပတ်သက်တာတော့ဝိပဿနာမဲ့ခင်နဲ့ဘုရားဘာကခေါ်တဲ့ဥပဒနာမဲ့ခင်နဲ့အရိယာမဲ့ခင်ဒီနှမျိုးကလိုရင်းပါပဲ
Sayadaw had already talked about this Eightfold Noble Path, which is a synonym for the middle way, in previous discourses. One should perhaps start with right view with regards to karma as one's own property. Then you can go through the various categories of the Eightfold Noble Path. But essentially, there are 2 main parts to the Eightfold Noble Path: the preliminary path and the noble path.
အရိယာမဲ့ရဲ့ရှေ့ပြေးဘုရားဘာကမဲ့ခေါ်တဲ့ဝိပဿနာမဲ့ခင်ပေါ့လေဒါဒီပွားရတယ်ဆိုတာကဘုန်းကြီးတို့ပိဋကသိကြတဲ့အတိုင်းပဲတပတ်6ဘက်ကဖြစ်ပြတဲ့ယုံနာတရားတွေသူတို့ဖြစ်စေလိုက်ပြီးတော့ရှုရတာပါပဲပထမဆုံးသီလပြည့်စုံပြီးတော့ပေါ့လေရှုနေတာပါပဲအထူးကြောင့်ညထားပြီးတော့ဆွဲမြဲဆိုတာရှုရအောင်မှစိတ်ကလေးစိုက်ကြအောင်ထဲမှာစိတ်နဲ့ချိန်တက်ပြီးတော့နောက်သဘောမှန်လေးတွေဒုက္ခသစ္စာထိုက်တဲ့သဘောမှန်လေးတွေသိနေအကြောင်းကျိုးဆက်ပုံလေးတွေသိနေ ခြေကားစပြီးတော့သိလာတာပဲ
The preliminary path, of course, refers to the development of the Vipassana Eightfold Path factors. This occurs before the Noble Path consciousness. As all of you know, the development of this preliminary path entails, firstly, a firm foundation in purity of conduct, and after that, a commitment to be energetic and effortful in activating mindfulness from moment to moment. With persistent and persevering effort, the mindfulness activated will bring about concentration, and this will also bring about if there is also accuracy of aim, then shortly concentration can be well developed, and wisdom will unfold of itself. There will be an insight into the true nature of reality in terms of mind and matter, their relationship by way of cause and effect, and also their character. Yeah.
အဲ့ဒီလိုပုဗ္ဗဘာကမေခင်ဥပဒနာမေခင်နဲ့မှာသီလမေခင်သမာဓိမေခင်ပညာမေခင်ဟာရှုတိုင်းသူတို့ကပါနေတာပဲသီလမေခင်လည်းပါသွားပြီသမာဓိမေခင်လည်းပါသွားပညာမေခင်လည်းပါသွားပြီအဲ့ဒါတွေဟာတစ်ချိန်နဲ့တစ်ချိန်အချိန်ရပြီးတော့အားပြည့်လာတဲ့အခါရှုမိတဲ့အာယုံရဲ့ယုံနာအာယုံရဲ့မမြဲပုံပေါ့လေသိမြင်တဲ့အနိစ္စ ानु ပဒနာဉာဏ်นี่လည်းဖြစ်လာတယ်ဘောလည်းပြောလိုက်နဲ့ဆင်းရဲပုံကိုယ်ထဲမှာတွေ့စိုးကြောင့်ခံစိုးအနေခက်ပုံတကယ်ဒုက္ခစိတ်တည်သိမြင်တဲ့ဒုက္ခ ानु ပဒနာဉာဏ်นี่လည်းဖြစ်လာတယ်ကိုယ်လိုတိုင်းမဖြစ်သူသဘောတိုင်းသူဖြစ်ပုံသိမြင်တဲ့အနတ္တ ानु ပဒနာဉာဏ်นี่လည်းဖြစ်လာတယ်ဥပဒနာမဲ့ခင်တွေကစပြီးတော့ဖြစ်လာတာနောက်မှတ်ရင်မှတ်သလောက်ဥပဒနာမဲ့ခင်တွေအစဉ်စဉ်တိုးလာတာအဲနောက်ဆုံးသင်္ကာရိပ္ပခညာပိုင်းအထိပေါ့လေဥပဒနာမဲ့ခင်ရှေ့ပြေးမဲ့ခင်တွေပွားနေတာပေါ့
With continued effort and conscientious mindfulness, one will be able to see how phenomena arise and pass away from moment to moment. Seeing this means that there is the occurrence of insight that contemplates the impermanence of phenomena. At times, however, one can feel a lot of suffering in watching these phenomena arise and pass away. There may be physical suffering as well as a deeper sort of suffering. This means that the insight that contemplates the characteristic of suffering, unsatisfactoriness, is being developed. Sometimes one can perceive the arising and passing away of these phenomena in terms of their selfless nature, that there is no one behind the whole process that is going on according to its own natural laws. This is insight that contemplates the characteristic of selflessness in phenomena. Thus, one can say that at this point, the Vipassana Eightfold Path has begun to develop. With deepening of practice, until insight knowledge of equanimity with regard to formations, this Vipassana Eightfold Path is being developed ever more deeply.
အဲ့ဒီလိုယုံနာနေပေါ်မှာမမျက်စိရဲ့သဘောပဲလို့သိမြင်တဲ့ဥပဒနာဉာဏ်တော်တော်ကြီးရင့်တာအားကောင်းလာပြီဆိုရင်မြင်နေကြကြားနေကြနားနေကြစားနေကြထိနေကြဒီအာယုန်တွေနဲ့တွေ့နေတာပဲမြင်ကြနားစားထိတွေ့နေတာပဲဒါပေမဲ့လို့အဲ့ဒီအာယုန်တွေကိုအကောင်းထင်ပြီးတော့မြဲတယ်လို့ထင်ပြီးတော့တာယာတတ်မဲ့မှုຢာကဖြစ်ပေါ်မလာဘူးအဲ့ဒါထူးခြားနေတာပဲပဂတိပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေကတော့ဒီအာယုန်တွေမြင်သွားလို့ရှိရင်တာယာတတ်မဲ့မယ်သူယောဂီမှာတော့ဝိပဿနာဉာဏ်ကြီးကတန်တန်ဖြစ်နေတော့တာယာတတ်မဲ့မှုပေါ်မလာဘူးပြီးတော့ဒီအာယုန်တွေပေါ်မှာလည်းစိတ်လိုချလွတ်ထားတာလည်းမဟုတ်ဘူးမျက်စိရဲ့သဘောပဲဆိုတဲ့ဝိပဿနာဉာဏ်တွေကအခြေခံအစပြီးတော့အစဉ်စဉ်ဖြစ်ပြီးတော့ရင့်ကျက်လာတဲ့အခါတာယာတတ်မဲ့စီရနဲ့တွေ့တော့မှတာယာတတ်မဲ့မှုမဖြစ်တော့ဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်အဲ့ဒါကာမဂုဏ်အာယုန်ကိုခံစားတဲ့ကာမတုခာလိကနိယောကအစွန်းတက်သွဲရှောင်လိုက်တာပဲလွတ်သွားတာပဲ
When this preliminary Eightfold Path is well developed, then the mind will be able to see all objects arising in terms of the characteristics of impermanence or suffering or non-self. What is unique about this level of practice is that at that point the yogi is still exposed to bombardment by all the six sense objects and the six sense doors. But there is no reaction to them. The mind is perfectly in equilibrium because it perceives all phenomena in the light of impermanence, suffering, and non-self. There is no clinging even to a very pleasant object. There is no attachment, no craving, no desire for any object whatsoever it may be, however pleasant, enticing, or tempting it may be. At this point, one says that the yogi is free from the first extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasure.
ဒီကာရုပ္ပခာညာဘဲလောက်များရောက်လာပြီဆိုရင်မိမိရဲ့စိတ်ကလေးဟာကာမဂုဏ်အာယုန်တွေစီလွတ်ပြီးတော့ဗောလေຢာကနှိုးကြည့်တာတော့မှမနှိုးဘူးကြက်တောင်လေးများမိနဲ့ရှုလို့ရှိရင်တွန့်လာ တရားပဲပဲပြန်တွန့်နေတာကာမဂုဏ်ပဲဆန့်သွားတာမရှိဘူးတနည်းအားဖြင့်လည်းပဲဒီခါမှာကာမဂုဏ်အာယုန်စီပေါ့ဒီစိတ်ကလေးတမင်္ဂလာလွှတ်ကြည့်တာတော့မှချက်ချင်းပြန်ပြီးတော့ရောက်တာဘာနဲ့တူလဲဆိုတော့ဘူးမရင်းဆိုတဲ့လက်နဲ့တူတာပဲပြစ်လိုက်တဲ့ဒီခါလေးချက်ချင်းပြန်လာတာပဲအဲ့ဒါလိုအနေမျိုးတော့ဖြစ်နေတာဒီတော့အမှန်တရားတတ်မဲ့စီကကောင်းတဲ့အာယုန်နေစီတော်မှစိတ်လှုပ်ပြီးတော့နှိုးကြည့်တာတော့မှမဖြစ်ဘူးဆိုတော့ကာမတုခလိကနိယောဂလမ်းစဉ်ဟာဒီခါလေးတည်းမှာရှောင်တိမ့်ပြီးသားဖြစ်နေတာပဲတော့
The resilience of the mind, the power of resilience of the mind, when this stage of Vipassana insight, called insight of equanimity, with regards to formations, is very apparent. For a yogi who has really attained, genuinely attained to such a stage of practice, will have such great strength of mind that even if he or she were to deliberately think of a very lustful object, the mind will not budge. Even if the yogi at that point were to deliberately let go of the mind to flee to any lustful or tempting object, the mind will act like a boomerang. It will come back immediately. It is also compared to a feather that is held very close to a flame. It will cringe back. There is no inclination at all to sensual pleasures. Thus, one can appreciate that the yogi at that particular stage of practice is free from the first extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasure.
ဒီလိုမိစ္ဆမပရိဒါအကျဉ်းလန်းစဉ်လိုက်သူများဟာအစားလဲစားနေတာပဲတင့်တော်တဲ့အစားအဝတ်လည်းပဲဝတ်နေတာပဲခုတုံးလုံးနေကြတာမဟုတ်ဘူးပြီးတော့နေရာထိုင်ခင်းလည်းပဲအိယာနေရာတွေလည်းပဲအသုံးပြုနေတာပဲပြီးတော့အရိယာဘုမျှတအောင်လည်းပဲစဉ္ညာလျှောက်လိုက်ထိုင်လိုက်လဲလိုက်ဒီလိုလုပ်နေတာပဲအပူအေးမျှတအောင်လည်းပဲနေကြတာပဲတကယ်လို့စားတင်တာမစားဝတ်တင်တာမဝတ်နေတဲ့နေရာမနေအပူအေးမျှတအောင်မနေဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ခန္ဓာကိုယ်ပင်မဆင်းရဲသွားမှာအခုတည်းမှာစားတင်တဲ့အစာစသည်ပေါ့လေစားပြီးတော့မျှတအောင်နေကြတာဖြစ်တော့ခန္ဓာကိုယ်လည်းမပင်မဆင်းရဲဘူးဟောအတ္တကိလနာနိယောကအစွန်းတသွယ်ကိုလည်းပဲရှောင်တိတ်ပြီးသားဖြစ်သွားတယ်
Yogis here too are required to eat sufficiently, appropriately, in order to maintain good health, in order to nourish the body. Suitable clothing is also being used. And also are lodgings. Lodging here is suitably provided for yogis. there is the effort is also being made by yogis to protect themselves from the changes of the weather, so that they can practice properly in spite of changes in temperature and so forth. Finally, they are also instructed to practice in a balanced way, balancing their postures. There is a time for sitting and there is a time for walking. There is a time for lying down, to sleep, and times to stand and to do other activities. So there is a balance of posture. There is no extreme involved in mortifying the body. You're not asked to starve. You're not asked to go around in a birthday clothes. You're not asked to expose yourself to extremes of temperature. You're not asked to maintain a single posture throughout your whole waking hours. There is no extreme. This extreme of self-mortification is not at all relevant in our situation here. So yogis are free. So a yogi can be free from these two extremes and can walk the middle path.
ဒီနေ့ယောဂီတယောက်ကတော့ဘုန်းကြီးလျှောက်သွားသေးတယ်။ယတာတဏှာတွေဖြစ်မှဆိုလို့တဲ့သူအစာငတ်ခံတယ်တဲ့။အဲ့ဒီအစာငတ်ခံတာကတော့ကိုယ်ပင်မဆင်းရဲအတ္တကိလမဏနိယောဂတစ်ဖက်ဆုံးရောက်သွားပါတယ်။
There was a yogi today who told the Sayadaw that because she was trying to overcome craving, she starved. She couldn't encourage craving to arise by eating because there was so much craving for food. In starving, in not allowing the body to be properly nourished and maintained, one has fallen into this extreme of self-mortification.
ဒီတော့စွမ်းသင်္ကန်းကြောင့်စီပစ္စည်းလေးပါစားစရာဝတ်စရာနေစရာအဲ့ဒါလိုအပ်လို့ရှိရင်စေဝပစ္စည်းပူအေးမြတ်တာအောင်အရိယဘုံမြတ်တာအောင်နေရတာဟာတမရည်ရွယ်ချက်ကောင်းကောင်းထွက်လာပြီခန္ဓာကိုယ်ပင်မမဆင်းရဲဘူးအတ္တကိလမဏနိယောဂအစွန်းတသွဲရှောင်နိုင်ဖို့ဆိုတာပေါ့လေဒီမှာရည်ရွယ်ချက်ကြီးထွက်လာပြီ
So there's a reason also why yogis are encouraged to have free access to medicines, to clothes, to suitable lodgings, so that the body can be well taken care of, it can be well nourished and kept in good condition to do the practice. In other words, these measures are preventive ones, made to avoid yogis from falling into the extreme of self-mortification. အဲ့ဒီလိုပြင်းထန်တဲ့အစွန်းတသွဲရှောင်နိုင်ဖို့စားစရာဝတ်စရာနဲ့မလွှဲမကင်းတာတဲ့မြင်စရာကြားစရာနားစရာစားစရာထိစရာပေါ့လေဒါတွေနဲ့ကြုံတွေ့တဲ့အခါမှာတာယာတက်မှတ်မှုမဖြစ်ရအောင်
မြင်တိုင်းမှတ်ရတာကြားတိုင်းမှနားတိုင်းမှစားတိုင်းမှထိတိုင်းမှသိတိုင်းမှအကုန်လုံးတွေကိုလိုက်ပြီးတော့မှတ်နေရတာပဲခုနမဲ့ခင်ရှိပါကျင့်တရားထည့်သွင်းပေးနေရတာပဲဟောထည့်သွင်းပေးနေတော့မှတ်ရတဲ့အာယုံမျက်စိရဲ့သဘောပဲဆိုတာသိနေရင်ပိုင်နေစွာမှတ်မိတဲ့အာယုံပေါ်မှာတာယာတက်မဲ့မှုပေါ်မလာတော့ဘူးအဲ့ဒီကာမတုခာလိကနုယောဂဒါလည်းပဲမဖြစ်တော့ဘူးဒီတော့ရှုမှတ်ရတာဟာကာမတုခာလိကနုယောဂအစွန်းတသွယ်ကိုအချောင်းဒီအစွန်းတသွယ်ကိုရှောင်ဖို့မှတ်ရတယ်ဆိုတာပေါ့လေဒီမှာရည်ရွယ်ချက်ထွက်လာတယ်
You will also notice that yogis are required to be mindful of whatever objects that are predominant, to be mindful of whatever objects that may arise very clearly at any of the six sense doors. There is also a reason behind this. In the absence of mindfulness, the mind can very easily crave for or desire the desirable objects that arise. And if there is desire and craving for pleasurable objects at any of the six sense doors, then one very automatically gets caught in the first extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasure. If mindfulness is present, on the other hand, there will be no occasion for the arising of craving, desire, or clinging, or attachment. Thus, the mind can be kept free from the first extreme of sensual indulgence. In fact, if mindfulness is strong enough to conduce the arising of wisdom, then one will be able to see into the true nature of reality and understand the characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, which will further bring about detachment from sensual objects. So these injunctions conform quite well to the middle way, for both extremes are avoided while one is developing the Eightfold Path factors.
အဲ့တော့သုံးဆောင်တဲ့ပစ္စည်းသုံးဆောင်ခြင်းစသည်ဖြင့်ခန္ဓာကိုယ်ပင်မမစင်းရအောင်လို့အတ္တကိလေသာနိယောဂအကျဉ်းလန်းစဉ်လဲရှောင်တင်းမိသားဖြစ်သွားပြီသုံးဆောင်တဲ့အခါမျိုးမှာလည်းပဲတာယာတက်မှတ်မှုမရှိရအောင်လို့ပုဗ္ဗဘာကမဲ့ခေါ်တဲ့ဥပဒနာတမ္မာတိဥပဒနာမဲ့ခင်လည်းပဲထည့်သွင်းပြီးပြီလို့ဆိုတော့ဟိုဘက်အစွန်းလည်းမရောက်ဒီဘက်အစွန်းလည်းပဲမရောက်ပါလိအစွန်းနဲ့သူကလွတ်နေတယ်ဒါဘ ਹੁ လမ်းကြောင်းကြီးတဲ့နေတယ်အဲ့ဒါပါဠိလိုမကြ္ကြီးမခေါ်တာပဲအလေလားတဲ့အဲ့ဒီလမ်းစဉ်အတိုင်းဆက်သွားလို့ရှိရင်ရှင်ရရဲ့ငြိမ်းရဖြစ်တဲ့နိဗ္ဗာန်အထိရောက်တာမဟုတ်လို့ပฏิပဒါလို့ခေါ်တယ်နိဗ္ဗာန်ရောက်ကြောင်းအကျင့်ကောင်းတဲ့နှစ်ရပေါင်းလိုက်တဲ့အခါကျတော့မကြ္ကြီးမပฏิပဒါအလေအလတ်နိဗ္ဗာန်ရောက်ကြောင်းအကျင့်ဆိုတာဒါပြောတာပဲ
Recoursing to proper medicines, clothing, lodging, and balance of postures ensures that one can be free from the extreme of self-mortification. And in order to be free from the first extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasure, the yogi is also required to be mindful every moment of his or her waking hours, especially when he or she is using these requisites: medicine, clothing, food, lodging, and so forth. When there is mindfulness there, then one can be free from the other extreme of indulgence in sensual pleasures. And precisely because these two extremes are kept way apart when one is developing the Vipassana Eightfold Path factors, this practice is called the middle way. It is the middle path to Nibbana.
Adi Chintia di Kavaloga Yima Mashizinga Tadawari Ma Tadawari Didi Seha Tadawuri Saditamari Pena Kore Jisu Nine 6 1 in Diari Mashijaro Tia Miari Pitchin and Pichara Soon at the Yochin and Yopara. Yes, up here to message at the hobby Bizawaki Nauga Asabori. Mizima Brimida Jin Lansin later. That in the Sachi, the 6 1 in Diaru Ha Tata Leve Tata SSP, Uria Leuria SSP. Edluni Absent, sell the low body. A semapia, Chitati at wet. Tamaseka Suravoli. Elmasavi of Povar.
Before the Buddha arose, this path of practice, this middle way, was quite unknown to beings present then in the world. As such, they were not free from the two extremes that we talked about just now, and they also did not have access to the controlling faculties of mind, namely faith, effort, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. Because they did not have these controlling faculties of mind, they could not exercise good discretion in doing what was right or wrong. They did according to their own whims and fancies. But when the Buddha arose and started to preach the Dhamma, first to the group of 5, and then to all those who were ready to listen, he started the ball rolling, so to speak. He started to arouse faith in truth. He started to arouse faith in those who listened, and that faith brought about motivation and effort, which again activated mindfulness, leading to development of concentration and the unfolding of wisdom. And these dhammas of faith and so forth started to roll, started to begin arising in beings who listened. And this is called the Dhammacakka, the wheel of the Dhamma.
အဲ့ဒီဓမ္မစက်ကိုဝိနည်းတတ္တဝါရဲ့တဏ္ဍာမှာဖြစ်စေခြင်းတနည်းအားဖြင့်လည်းပဲဖြစ်အောင်တရားဟောတော်မူခြင်းကိုဓမ္မကျက်ကပဝတ္တနာလို့ခေါ်ပါတယ်
So this course given in order to arouse these 5 types of controlling faculties is called the setting into motion or the rolling, because it sets into motion or rolls the wheel of dhammas called the controlling faculties.
ဟောစရာတွေကတော့အများကြီးရှိနေပါသေးတယ်အချိန်ကလွန်လောင်သွားပြီဒီနေ့ဒါပဲတော်ကြဥစု
This will be all for today.